When I started university 5 years ago, my parents rented me a small flat in an old apartment building near the school. I believe that everyone might have had a reckless childhood, but no one should be like me, since I had witnessed a terrifying event. That night, I went back to my passion, climbing to the next balcony, and of course, not to steal anything, but because living in the room next door was a really attractive girl who attended the same school as me. I had no dirty intentions. I simply wanted to see her every day and watch her read, study, or simply clean the room. I would be at her balcony at 10 p.m. sharp every night, carefully opened the curtains with my hand and peeked inside. She appeared to be sweeping the floor at the time, carrying a piece of paper in her hand, and she looked quite cheerful. But then I realized she was talking to someone. I began to wonder who she was talking to, or whether she was using a headset to make a phone call. Most likely, she was chatting to her lover. Her body leaped abruptly.
Honey, don't do that while I'm cleaning the floor.
Despite the fact that she was dressed simply in a shirt and pants, her body was really appealing. She was staring into the air with wide round eyes and curly eyelashes, producing a gentle voice. Was she practicing a play? It wouldn't have made me feel like a genuine man was really there in front of her if it was simply talking on the phone. It was clear that they were practicing a play, although this one appeared to be a bit too sensitive. Standing behind the window frame made me feel more thrilled and shy than I had ever felt before. Was she actually acting in a play? If only I could play the male lead. She slid down the sofa, her thin but plump body hidden behind those garments. Everything was made more appealing by the long hair that fell on the sofa. Sweating heavily and taking slow, deep breaths, it looked like she was hugging someone. Even if it was only a rehearsal, it looked so real. This was quite daunting for a teenager like me. I stood there for a long time, and despite the fact that there was dew on the ground, I didn't feel cold at all. At the moment, I was still thinking, wow, I truly hit the jackpot today. That night, even though I returned to my room, I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning and thinking about the scenario at the time. To be honest, I was such a pervert back then. I went to school the next day with dark circles under my eyes and couldn't open them since I couldn't sleep all night. I was walking back to my room from school when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. The corridor was empty, and no one was there. Something piqued my attention as I was ready to return to my room. And what I noticed was the door key, which was still plugged into the door handle of a room. Maybe because my neighbor forgot it in a rush. I was extremely curious to see how it would be like in her room, and how it felt to lay down on her bed. And it seemed that tiny monster in my mind had triumphed, since curiosity and intrigue compelled me to open it. My heart began to feel guilty as the door opened, but my hands couldn't stop. I was acting exactly like a pervert. I entered the room gently, opening the door. A feminine smell wafted through the room, erasing some of my shame. The space was poorly lit and quite empty. Curiosity raised again inside me after standing for a while and gazing around the room. I began digging through the shelves, through photo albums, books. I didn't even remember what I was looking for. I was perplexed by the underwear dangling from above. This was the bathroom. Such a girl she was. There were many different kinds of shower gels, It also had a very pleasant and enticing fragrance. And as I proceeded to the back door of the room, which had to be the bedroom, I swiftly opened the door and peered into the room out of curiosity. I'm sorry, I didn't intend to come in here. I was terrified because there was a man sleeping on the bed, her lover without a doubt. A tall man laying still on the bed appeared to be sleeping, and I might have jolted him awake. I'm sorry, please don't beat me, I didn't intend anything bad, I said loudly, hoping he would pardon me while hiding my face with my hands for fear of getting slapped. When I spotted the key on the door, I decided to bring it in and give it back to the owner, I said. True though, doing bad things was simple to stress about. My sweat was streaming and I'd always been a coward. Then I gradually calmed myself and opened my eyes again after explaining with my eyes still closed. What a strange thing it was for me to summon the courage to face him in the eyes. He was like a statue, laying immobile on the bed. Only now I got the courage to investigate further, and it turned out to be a humanoid statue. It's a statue? What brought it here? I was still sweating heavily and terrified. A frightening noise sounded from behind me before I could restore my calm. The door behind slowly opened. Perhaps there were still people at home. There had to be someone inside, or the door would not have been opened. However, when the door was fully opened, I was able to see well inside. Oh, what a dreadful sight I would never forget. It was the kitchen, and there was a dark shadow standing there, shaped like a human. But it was simply a murky, hazy shadow, and it was slowly making its way towards the door, and me. The closer it approached, the more its shape twisted, becoming even more horrifying. My legs were paralyzed and I couldn't move. I was standing at the door, trying to get out. I was able to jump out the door with all my remaining power and fell to the ground. And as soon as I got out the door, I collected all my bravery and kicked the door shut in the aim of locking the monster inside. After that, I sprang up and sprinted like an athlete, wishing I could get out of this place as soon as possible. All of my tiredness and exhaustion when I got home from school vanished. I could only close my eyes and run oblivious to the moon. That night, I went to a friend's house to sleep, and I didn't dare to tell anybody about it because honestly, I hadn't done anything to be proud of back then, and telling it would be humiliating. After a few days, I notified my school that I was going to live in the school dormitory, and now that I've had the confidence to tell you this narrative that I've kept concealed until now, I'm sharing it with you in this video.
My name is Yao. After leaving my hometown for the city, I got a job in a good company. Because I was a quiet person, most of the time in the company I didn't even interact with my colleagues. There's only one person that I talked to the most. Maybe it was because we were the same age. It seemed to be easy to communicate with one another. We had many topics in common. His name was Jakey, and he was working in the same department as I was. One day, Jakey went to work with a tired and sluggish look. Normally, he was very cheerful and a sociable person. He always smiled and said hello when he met his colleagues, but today, he passed me without even looking. I was surprised, so I called him over. I discovered that his face was not just tired, but also looked kind of emaciated, like someone who was severely undernourished, so I asked him more about it. After hearing his story, I couldn't help but be shocked and didn't know what to say to Jakey, but he said that recently he was looking for a new room to rent. According to him, he saw a poster about a room for rent on a board in that neighborhood. Because the rent was quite cheap, as soon as he looked at the poster, he was attracted to it. So he immediately contacted the owner of the inn and scheduled a visit to see the room. The room was in a house. The road to get there was also quite easy and also close to the company. Jakey could walk to work, so he can save quite a bit of money too. Would all be shared with other people in other rooms in the house. The room is also relatively old, not new at all. So he was thinking, but because the price was cheap and the owner kept standing next to him, he was convinced and agreed to move in. After that, the owner also intended to ask Jakey to give him the money first hand. Without thinking much, he just thought it was fine to give the money to the owner. He was worried that maybe he would spend that money on something else. Nothing was strange at this point. It was just that Jakey felt his room was a bit cold, but he didn't notice anything strange. On the same floor as Jakey, there was another man. He had a rough appearance that looked like a market gangster. He seemed to have just moved in there about a week before him. He often sat in the living room and watched television. His voice was very loud. According to the phone calls that Jakey overheard, it seemed that he did not have a decent job. Frequently, there were calls that made him uncomfortable, and then he scolded badly, as if his job was to collect loans. That was the type of tone he had. But because he didn't socialize, Jakey didn't want to be curious about other people's lives. He just overheard it briefly and didn't pay any attention. Jakey just passed him and went to the window to dry clothes. Strange things only started happening when Jakey was there for almost a month. That night Jakey worked late, so when he arrived the house was dark. Because it was late, Jakey quickly got ready and went to take a shower, but as he passed the living room, he heard a sound. Curious, Jakey stopped by to check it out, because by the time he got home, he didn't see anyone. Everyone had already gone to their rooms and turned off the lights to go to sleep a long time ago. At this moment, the living room TV was being turned on and hosting a food program or something. On the sofa, there was a figure of someone watching intently. Jakey tried to look closely to see who it was, but it was completely impossible to see the face. Then suddenly, it blurred in a vague way, even though the light from the television was still shining brightly. By default, it was the scary gangster guy on the same floor. Jakey didn't think much, so he continued to go to the bathroom. After taking a shower, Jakey was about to return to his room when he saw that the TV was still playing the food program from earlier, but it was empty. Jakey was angry because he thought the scary gangster guy didn't turn off the TV after finishing watching. Jakey accidentally stepped on something sticky on the ground near the sofa. It was dark yellow and very sticky. Curiously, Jakey touched it, and as soon as he brought it up to see what it was, a rancid smell hit his nose. It was like the smell of decaying food. It made Jakey extremely nauseous, but he still tried to get a mop to clean the floor. After all, it was still a common area, and he couldn't just leave it like that. There was another strange thing that made him think. That room of the scary gangster guy was very quiet. The lights had been turned off since Jakey came back. Even when he saw a figure sitting on the sofa in his room, there was no light either. Was it true that he watched TV? Nah, Jakey didn't feel too suspicious, so he quickly returned to his room. Anyway, he still had to go to work early the next morning. Not long after, the company held a birthday party for Jakey. He drank until he got drunk and then dragged himself home. At this time, his mind was no longer clear. He was so drunk that he couldn't even go to his room, so he fell on the couch to sleep without caring about anything around him. Now the drunkenness had completely overpowered him. In the dream, he felt his whole body going cold. Even the air around him suddenly turned very cold. Now he thought he was drunk, but he could still feel the cold air. At the time he was half awake, Jakey saw the TV suddenly turned on and was showing some food programs again. He didn't know who turned it on. Maybe it was the scary gangster guy again. From the darkness of the house, a tall, black, scary figure approached him. Although the figure was large, his steps were very light. None of the movements could be heard, as if he was gliding towards him off the ground. Suddenly the big man figure approached and he used his tongue to lick Jakey's face. Although he hadn't woken up from his drunkenness yet, he could completely feel the stickiness on his face. So immediately he got up from his drunken state and also found that he was indeed being harassed by someone. He panicked and shouted loudly. Then he also stood up from the sofa and flailed his arms and legs to chase this pervert away. But the strange thing was that the moment the figure seemed to be vaporized into thin air. Only Jakey was left in the dark room and the glimmer of light coming from the television. At this moment he was extremely shocked. He didn't know if he was dreaming or awake. At first Jakey still thought that he was too drunk, so he was a bit paranoid. But after touching his own face, he suddenly felt a burning pain, like he was burned with boiling water, and that pain was right where he felt the lick from someone. Jakey started to panic. He rushed to the bathroom to look in the mirror, and indeed, in the painful spot, his skin was also tanned and dry. His face looked suddenly sunken. After that, Jakey was also unable to explain what happened to him, just because he was drunk. So he was paranoid at that time, but he himself knew that everything was not that simple to explain. An invisible fear prevented Jakey from standing for too long in the living room or sitting on the sofa again. Every day when going to work and after work, Jakey always passed by the living room. Every time he couldn't help but look curiously at the sofa. It made him shiver and then recall the incident that night. One day he got off work as usual. Then it was already dark and Jakey went to the bathroom to change. Even though he didn't want to, he needed to go there. He had to go across the sofa. Finishing everything, Jakey went to his room to go to bed early, but he remembered that he had to return to the company, so he had to carry his bag to go out. After returning, Jakey saw the scary gangster guy. He just sat there and watched TV on the sofa. Fearing that the scary gangster guy would face something scary like Jakey did, Jakey spoke up and tried to warn him about it. He said that chair had a problem and advised him to go to his room sooner. But of course, his words were completely useless to a gangster. He saw Jakey as a coward and a paranoid person while mocking Jakey. Jakey was so angry that he didn't want to interfere anymore. He angrily left and went to his room and thought he would never care about the gangster guy again. So, to relieve his frustration, Jakey took out his phone and played a few games to clear his mind and stop thinking about other things. After a while, Jakey also prepared to take a bath. The living room was so quiet then. No more laughing from this gangster guy. Jakey also felt strange. Stepping out of his room, Jakey saw the gangster guy still sitting on the chair, but strangely enough he didn't move at all. He was just sitting like a statue. His body was shaking in waves. Sweat was pouring out like rain, drenching his face. He wanted to call out for help, but he couldn't open his mouth or move anymore. Entering the bathroom door, Jakey panicked when he looked in the mirror and saw a shadow of a person standing outside by the sofa. There was not only the gangster guy there, but something else. He clearly saw a tall man standing behind the gangster guy, his hands holding the guy's shoulders, making his whole body motionless. Jakey knew that the man behind the gangster guy was definitely not a human. Next, he suddenly bent down and licked the gangster guy's head. So that was exactly the same thing that happened to Jakey that night. He was licked. It was true that he wasn't paranoid. The big fat guy pressed his shoulder tightly with his hand. His whole body was drenched with sweat. His eyes widened like a person who was near death. Just like Jakey, the top of the head where the fat guy licked him was immediately red and swollen with a long streak. It didn't stop there. He continued to look again, his face gray and sore, and he also secreted something greasy in the hideous areas. Strangely, this time the licked place was no longer simply red and swollen. It started to develop large and small blisters all over the wound. That looked extremely nauseating and horrible. It seemed that the gangster guy could still feel everything, but couldn't move or resist. He could only glance around. Seeing such a terrifying scene, Jakey was also extremely panicked. He wanted to scream but was so afraid that angry fat man would harm the living people. He was confused too as to how to help the gangster guy. He looked around to see if there was anything that could be used in a situation like this. Finally, he discovered that the aluminium basin in his hand would work. Gritting his teeth to gather courage, Jakey decided to risk his life even though he was very scared. He rushed over and knocked hard on the bowl. It caused shrill noises and made the gangster guy's whole body jump. And it seemed that this method worked. The hideous ghost no longer controlled the guy, but had turned his attention to Jakey. The ghost looked at Jakey with an angry expression, because he dared to ruin his business. Its whole face was clearly visible. Its eyes were white and its face became soggy and sticky with mucus. For a moment, Jakey suddenly had a bold idea. He thought to wake the gangster guy out of his ambiguity, so he ignored the ghost standing next to him and rushed to use the laundry basin to hit the gangster guy in the head. The blow that hit the man made him swoop forward and hit his face on the table. Right after that, Jakey also realized that the ghost was still standing behind him. Worried that he would control him as he did with the gangster guy, Jakey ran as fast as he could into his room to hide there. He also hoped that this way he could make the fat ghost disappear. A few minutes later, Jakey dared to show his face out of the door to observe what was going on. A man who knew only studying like him really had to put all his courage to do scary things like that. But fortunately, the gangster guy recovered his sanity. He sat on the ground and rubbed his head with his hand. Seeing Jakey in the distance, his eyes filled with tears and his face was contorted. He ran over and hugged Jakey like a baby and cried. He also recounted that he was watching TV when he felt someone's hands holding his shoulders, which made his whole body stiff with fear. Even when he was licked on top of his head, he could clearly feel the burning pain. As soon as the both of them calmed down, they decided to go to the house owner to find out what was going on. With a rough face and a scary aura of the gangster guy, the owner quickly told all the truth. He said it was true that a person had just died in that living room. But because he was afraid of the impact on the rent, he tried to hide it away. It was a tall and very fat man. He was always eating something. He worked in the stock market, so as soon as he saw the clean room he was satisfied and moved in right away. He ate a lot, and he did not exercise. With no relatives coming to visit him, he started to fall ill. One day, while watching TV in the living room, he passed away from a heart attack. After listening, the gangster guy was extremely angry and asked the owner to return the rent to him. And about Jakey, he wanted the owner to rent it out for free to Jakey if he continued to stay there. Only a few months later, the wound on the gangster's head quickly became cold, but it still left a big scar. He didn't mind that. Maybe it made his job easier to be scary. It is really cool to have such a big scar on the top of your head when you need to collect debts.
After years of saving, I was finally able to buy myself a small apartment in the city. This place was very crowded and life here was quite busy, but that was okay because all my efforts were all rewarded. Since all my savings went into the house, I didn't have much left, so furniture was also a big deal for me. But luckily, I joined a number of groups that specialized in second-hand sales, and I also could find the items I liked. Without hesitation, I contacted the seller and ordered them immediately. The delivery also arrived very soon. The seller also seemed to be the owner of these items. He looked pretty happy when he sold them to me. He also directly helped the transport team. Each item was loaded from the truck. I also stood beside him to observe everything. As soon as I saw them, my eyes lit up, because in my mind I thought that when I bought liquidated goods, I would probably encounter old and slightly damaged items, but beyond my imagination, they were amazingly new. I quickly went back to ask the owner again to be sure if he really sold these items for less than half of the price. He seemed to be amused by my questions, so he laughed out loud. He didn't forget to tell me not to worry. All of these items were used by the family and bought recently because they moved to another place to live, and they wanted to liquidate them quickly so they can move on time. After saying that, he waved to the transporters to quickly bring the furniture into the house. I didn't know what to say other than thanking him a lot. If it weren't for him, I would have to find friends to borrow money from temporarily to buy furniture. In turn, large items were also carried inside, including tables and chairs, beds and decorations for the room. After everything was moved into the house, they also left and I started to clean my house. A few hours later, although I was sweaty and a little tired, when I looked back at my house I felt very relieved. Although it was not too big and spacious, it had been my dream since coming to the city to set up my business. Finishing it myself today, I was a little emotional. After finishing all the cleaning, I also had time to sit down on the soft sofa to make a phone call. I planned to send a message to thank the owner for selling me the furniture again, but after joining the group to find him, I was a bit surprised. Because I was kicked out of that second-hand group, even though that man blocked me, I was unable to send him messages anymore. For a moment I wondered deeply, because I remembered that in the morning I didn't do anything to make him angry. Why would he go to this extent? After that, I didn't think much of it. Maybe because he moved to another place. He didn't use his old website anymore. Because I was very tired after cleaning, after taking a shower, I went to bed immediately. That night, I didn't know exactly what time. It must have been around midnight. I was sleeping when I faintly heard some strange noises coming out. It woke me up. I listened to it. It seemed to be the cry of a child. It was not loud, but it was like it was coming from a faraway place. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. At first I thought it was the sound of the neighbors next door. They must have had young children, so they cried every now and then. But then the crying got louder and louder. I couldn't sleep, so I sat up. Sitting still for a while in bed, I suddenly realized that the strange sound was not coming from outside the house, but from my living room. It was exactly the moaning and crying of a baby. I got out of bed and gently opened the room door to look outside. As soon as I opened the living room door, I had no doubts that a very loud cry came from just outside. The room was quiet and dark, giving me goosebumps. I looked at the far corner of the room where the big wardrobe I just bought in the morning was. The sound of children crying came from there, no doubt. But why was there crying right in my house? I was a bit wary. I looked over to the side of the bedroom door. I had a baseball bat. I also was a little scared at this time because maybe some thief was trying to scare me or something, but I still decided to check it out. I grabbed the baseball bat and walked out of the living room step by step. Standing in front of the closet door, the crying didn't stop but became clearer. A little hesitant. What if inside there was a thief waiting for me to open the door? He would immediately do bad things to me. But I finally mustered up my courage and opened the closet door slightly, then peered inside to check. What scared me was that behind the door there was a woman holding a baby. Her hair was drooping and the baby looked dead. Its eyes had just big, scary black holes. Suddenly she turned around and looked at me directly with her white eyes and angry expression. She screamed in pain, her eyes also filled with a lot of blood, looking very scary. At this point I was so scared that my whole body froze. I was both surprised and panicked. I screamed out loud. Even though I wanted to turn and run, my legs were stiff, so I fell on my back to the ground. I knew she wasn't human. I tried with the last of my strength to crawl out of there, but I couldn't, and she still screamed in that high-pitched voice. She thought I was her husband and kept saying I abandoned her and her baby. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw myself up and tried to run away from the house. Behind me, I knew that a strange woman and a child was still trying to chase after me. In my greatest panic, I immediately ran to the neighbor's house to ask for help. I kept banging on the door and screaming. The neighbors in the block heard my voice and immediately opened the door. As soon as I saw them, I immediately told the story that I met at the house. But at first, everyone around thought that the scary woman was just an intruder in my house. So we decided to try to catch the thief. I pointed to the closet, convinced that this woman was hiding there. But when they opened the closet, the woman and her baby were gone. This made everyone around feel extremely surprised. Only one man had a premonition that something was wrong. He opened the door and looked up at the hidden corner of the cabinet and discovered something horrible. It was a red talisman that had been glued to the corner of the cabinet where no one noticed, and that was the cause of everything. We immediately took off the red talisman. He started to be panicked. No one seemed to believe their eyes. When the talisman was removed, it revealed the long black hair wrapped inside. Many people told me that this was a talisman and a spell used to imprison the soul of a person who died unjustly. I listened to the advice of my neighbors, immediately brought this red talisman and burned it to ashes, and then disposed of the wooden cabinet. I smashed the cabinet to pieces and threw it outside, then bought myself a new one. Since then, I never saw the scary woman ever again.
I went on a business trip for a few days a long time ago. Fortunately, I was able to find a low-cost day-to-day apartment for rent near my workplace. I took the time after landing in the afternoon to have dinner, then carried my luggage to the apartment where I would be staying. The apartment that I rented was on the 3rd floor. The entire corridor had also very few rooms, and the quiet atmosphere made me quite happy. After finding my apartment, I took the key and was about to enter when I met a student girl walking up from the stairs who lived on the same floor as me. She became more timid as soon as she saw me, making me a little shy.
I greeted her politely first, and she also responded. I introduced her that I was staying in this apartment. Suddenly, the girl's attitude changed. She looked at me with serious eyes, and she said loudly, "You can't stay here." I just stood there surprised and perplexed, staring at her with my eyes wide open. I tried to ask her why I couldn't be here, but she kept saying, you can't, okay? You can't," instead of explaining anything else. After a few sentences, she hastily said goodbye to me and left, leaving me with a lot of unanswered questions in my head. I also wanted to keep her to stay to ask more questions, but it was late and I needed to rest, so I said nothing and kept doing my stuff. I carried my luggage into the room, couldn't help thinking about what the girl had said. I dashed to the bathroom as soon as I arrived to wash my face and took a shower. I went to my bedroom and sat on the large bed in the center of the room, checking my phone. I was sitting on the bed, earphones in my ears, my gaze fixed on the exciting football match on the screen. Because this apartment only had one bedroom, the entire place had descended into a terrifying silence. I was so engrossed in the match that I screamed like a fan watching it live at the football pitch. After watching, I quickly placed my phone on the bed to prepare for food after a long and exhausting day of traveling. I soaked an Everescent tablet in a glass of water before going to bed to boost my resistance and started drinking it. My body began to feel tired after drinking. I immediately placed a glass of water on the dressing table beside the bed and began to recline. But as soon as I was looking down across the mirror, I noticed a dark figure reflecting in the mirror staring at me. I was startled unconsciously and quickly turned around to check, but there was no one behind me. The entire room was just me. I sighed, thinking I was so tired that I became dizzy. I forgot about the strange thing and went to bed, continuing to look at my phone and talk to my family. I started to feel sleepy at midnight, leaving me with no choice but to sleep. But I couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning. There was always a feeling in my heart that a certain heat was blowing up from under my bed. I started sweating on my brows, and the room had been drained of air, leaving only unpleasant hot air and a suffocating burning smell. I had the impression that someone was sitting behind me at the time, but I couldn't open my eyes to see because I was so tired, until the heat and burning smell became unbearable that I awoke, opened my eyes quickly and saw a thick grey smoke flying in front of me. I turned around in fear, startled. Two people as black as coal appeared in front of my eyes. Smoke erupted from their entire bodies and sat at my feet. Their bodies emitted the revolting odor of burnt meat. They didn't say anything and sat quietly on the bed face down, eyes fixed on some unknown space. I tried to rub my eyes and regain my composure while staring at the two people in front of me. They appeared to be real human beings, but they had no skin, and the flesh beneath had been burned to black, revealing the muscles deep within the body. The biggest and most muscular one appeared to be a man, as his body looked to be very solid. I believed the person next to me was a woman. I saw her flesh melting in the smoke like an ice cream under the sun. I believed this was a prank by the apartment owner to defraud me of my rent, so I quickly drew up the blanket, sat up, and inquired as to who these two strange people were and why they were in my room. Both of them did not respond. Instead, they turned to face me with their deformed faces. They opened their mouths and moved their lips as if they wanted to say something but couldn't because of the burns on their mouth and tongue muscles. After a while, both of them stood up, their eyes fixed on me. I was so terrified by the scene that I froze. I held my hands tight on the bed, didn't dare to move. The heat and smoke also caused the sweat on the forehead to flow more profusely. After that, both black shadows rushed towards me and pressed against me, leaving me speechless. The two began to howl, expressed a great pain on their faces. The smoke was also becoming thicker, as if it wanted to swallow them both. Both of them kept rushing to me, looking at me with pleading eyes, but their mouths stiffened, unable to speak. when the man rushed over and grabbed my shoulders, then pressed his hot, burning body against mine. Then I felt his body pressing against my face like a giant coal, causing me to scream in pain. After a while, the smoke and the hot air began to dissipate, but I felt as if I had entered a completely different world. My mind was racing like a drunk, and my limbs were frozen in place, making me hard to breathe. I found myself in this room in the blink of an eye, but the arrangement had changed, and there was now a couple sleeping on the bed. Outside, the husband neatly parked the motorcycle next to the door and carefully locked it. For no apparent reason, the bottom of the tire burst into flames. The fire engulfed the motorcycle in an instant, incinerating it in just a few minutes. The couple was awakened by the sound of the engine crackling outside and the smell of smoke. They were both startled to sit up when they saw the fire spread throughout the house. The fire burned the entire door and then spread all over 4 corners of the wall, followed the brick floor below to attack the couple's bed and burned the blanket below. Because there was no way out, the couple was trapped inside, preying on the raging fire. The scene appeared to be hell. The young couple writhed in the sea of fire, their bodies shrinking and turning black. The fire eventually turned them both into disfigured skeletons, blackened and stiff as coal. Everything in this room was completely burned down when the rescue team arrived. After the dream ended, I was startled to find myself in the same accident room, confused and unsure of what was going on. My head throbbed with excruciating pain at the same time. I had to try to hold my head before crawling up, only to discover that I had been lying on the ceramic floor for who knows how long. I exhaled laboriously. Fortunately, what I saw was either the past of the room or a nightmare, and I was still safe and sound. I was haunted by the nightmare. Later, I discovered that this apartment had a fire before, and that the house's owner couple had also died in the fire. The next day, I contacted to give back the room and quickly found myself a new room. The owner was also aware of the reason, so he did not make things difficult for me, and I relocated to another apartment. This story happened to me about 3 years ago. At that time, after graduating from university, I got a pretty good job in the city. I also rented a small apartment near the company for convenience on the way to work. Everything was going well until I kept having the same very increasingly terrifying dream. In my dream, I saw myself going to a very dark place, not to see anything around. At that time, in front of me began to appear an extremely attractive white light. During the dream, my body felt very constricted, unable to naturally control as usual. That flash of light began to absorb my body like a powerful storm, making me unable to resist. At first, the dream was not clear, but later it became more and more stressful. Finally, in that light appeared a person whose face was very similar to mine. He had only half of his upper body and one arm that looked very scary. I tried weakly to push him away, but to no avail. He looked at me with dark eyes and a sly smile, and said strange words. He wanted me to return this body and would get it soon. I tried to dodge, but he reached out his hand to catch me. My body still couldn't control itself. I kept asking who he was, but all I got in return was his savage laughter. He rushed at me, clung to me, then continued to say that he would take back everything that belonged to him. I panicked and pushed him away with all my might. I was startled to wake up, but the feeling of being held by him remained intact and did not disappear. That feeling was real, not just an ordinary nightmare. Sweat drenched my whole body. This day was the 20th day in a row that I dreamt of that terrifying man. I panicked and screamed in my dream. When I woke up, I was extremely thirsty and had a sore throat. I decided to go to the kitchen to get a drink. The glass of cold water that ran down my throat made my whole body feel a little bit lighter. I started thinking about that dream. Back in bed, I didn't dare to go back to sleep even though it was just past 3 o'clock in the morning. I knew for sure that if I went back to sleep, I would continue to dream. I was afraid that maybe I had some serious illness. That whole night, I couldn't sleep well. As soon as it was morning, I quickly left the house to go to the hospital. I hoped that the doctor would find a way to help me. At the hospital, I signed up for a general checkup of the whole body, and to my surprise, the doctor said that I was completely healthy, without any symptoms of any disease. Then I told the doctor about my dreams. He thought I was having a psychological problem, so he referred to me to a private psychotherapist. I immediately followed that given address to the doctor's house. Thanks to the referral, I didn't need to make an appointment or make an appointment in advance. Inside the house, we sat across from each other. The doctor began to ask me about my situation. I also very seriously told the story that I was having. Then the doctor also gave me a lot of advice. But the following nights, I continued to dream. The scary man chased after me, demanding my body, making it impossible for me to sleep well. I still continued to find a psychiatrist to talk about my problems, but after a few treatments, there was still no improvement, so the doctor had to give up. So I had to go back, thinking about my problem while walking. Maybe I had to accept that. Because I didn't get enough sleep, even seriously lacking sleep, my body was always in a lethargic state. My work was also stagnant, causing my boss to scold me and affect my work a lot. That day, I left with a colleague. I also told him my story because the two of us are also relatively close in the company. After hearing everything, he suggested that I see a shaman. He thought this may be related to spiritual issues. But I thought those people were just scammers. I was not originally the type of person who believes in ghosts, so I didn't even agree about going to a shaman. That night, I had a dream as soon as I took a nap, but this time it was strange that I could completely control my body and my thoughts. But everything was still the same. It was still a very dark space that couldn't see anything around and couldn't see the other man, so I tried to run away. Suddenly my body felt extremely heavy. I looked back and saw that the man had been clinging to my back ever since. This time he didn't keep his distance to talk to me like before. His voice rang out. He said it was time for me to disappear to give him my body. I wouldn't be able to escape. Panicked, I used all my strength to pull him out of my body. His body clung to me just as he said that I was about to disappear from this body. It was difficult for me to break free from his grasp. It also hurt my hand from his clinging. He still didn't show any anger, but in return he gave a scary smile and said that my body was his own sooner or later, so he wouldn't rush to wait until the time was right. Although scared, I still tried to ask who he was, why he was clinging and wanting to harm me like that. After that, I also warned him to stay away from me. Otherwise, I decided not to stand still and wait to die. But he didn't seem to mind my threats. He revealed his true form with a mouth wide to ear and black eyes. He said that what belonged to him came back to him and then disappeared. I woke up. It was already morning. As always, I was so tired that I couldn't breathe. The feeling was still as intact as in a dream. I felt my hand hurt. After looking back, the bruise was still there. It was clear that everything happened, not a dream. At this point, I understood that the doctors in the hospital could not help me. What I needed was something spiritual. I immediately took out my phone and contacted a colleague. I remembered the shaman he introduced. Although I didn't trust spirituality very much, this was probably my last hope. When I mentioned it, my colleague thought I was making fun of him, because just the other day I said many bad things about this shaman. After listening to my explanation, my colleague also believed I wanted to see that shaman, so he was very excited. He immediately gave me an appointment. After work, they would meet there and go to the shaman together. I was so impatient that I arrived at the appointment earlier than planned, but when I got there, I also saw a colleague who had been there before. Maybe he's also interested in my story. Along the way, he also introduced a lot about the shaman. It seemed that he took the shaman very seriously. Arriving at the place, the colleague also advised me a few things before entering. After having said that, he went to knock on the door and called the shaman. It seemed that he was very familiar with the place. An older man with no hair on his head and a cheerful face opened the door for us. He greeted his colleague enthusiastically. After that, the colleague quickly told the shaman about my story and hoped that he could help. The shaman looked at me. The atmosphere became silent. I did not know what he was doing, only seeing him looking at me for a long time. Then he said that the grudge had existed since before birth. This thing was inevitable because the resentment was too great. I was still bewildered. I didn't understand what was going on and didn't know what to say. My colleague asked the shaman on my behalf again. The shaman said that maybe I didn't know about my twin brother when I was still in the womb, but my mother could only keep my brother or me, and she chose me. When I heard that, I was surprised because I had never heard my mother talk about this. The shaman added that my twin brother was the one I had seen in my dream. At this point, my head suddenly hurt so bad. Maybe what the shaman said was true. That was why my body reacted so violently. Perhaps that the twin brother was also very distressed and deeply resentful of me. That also made me extremely self-blame. Seeing this, the shaman also comforted me. He said it was not my fault and that this choice was a must for my mother to make. I did not want to harm my brother, so I asked the shaman to help him without hurting him. The shaman then took out 2 talismans and gave them to my colleague and me. He told us to put it on. It would protect us. Next, the shaman clapped his hands together, muttering some incantation. Gradually in front of me, the man I met in my dream also appeared. It seemed that the shaman wanted to talk to him. The shaman wanted to let him understand that the previous choice had nothing to do with me and should not hold such hatred, but the man disagreed about it. The shaman was still very patient, continued to explain to him, and hoped that he would transcend reincarnation. But he became angry. He looked straight at me and asked if I was thinking about gratitude. Why did not give him my body, but use a shaman? Obviously, I wanted to erase him again. His question was so direct that I didn't know how to answer for a moment. In the end, the more he spoke, the angrier he became, and he assumed we wanted to kill him again. So he immediately rushed towards me, wanting to take over my body. Of course, the shaman didn't give him that chance. The shaman flew over and dealt him a blow. His face has become disfigured, very ferocious like evil spirits, not the shape I still saw. He still couldn't figure out what he did wrong. He just wanted to be alive. Without saying much more, the shaman took a small vase. He began to perform strange movements and chanted mantras. Immediately, my brother's soul was sucked into a small vase without being able to resist. The shaman closed the vase's mouth, his face a little sad. I hope the shaman didn't hurt my brother because I owe him too much. The shaman told me to rest assured because he will find a way to reincarnate my brother into a member of another good family. That thing made me feel more secure. Since then, I no longer dreamt of him, but in my heart, I still had a lot of guilt about my twin brother.